Hello, I'm here to talk to you today about Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. At its core, it's a theory that tries to show that language affects how people think and act. Now, it's not in the textbook, but Dr. Miller will reference it occasionally, so it's a good idea to have background knowledge of it. So what is it? Well, the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis itself, the name, is kind of a misnomer, because Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf worked together in the 1930s and 40s at Yale, but they never co-authored anything together, and they never actually had a hypothesis per se. And so what it is, though, is a bunch of ideas by them about languages affecting how people think and act, along with some empirical data they had, that later scientists and lay linguists came on and put main ideas behind. And the main categories that we now put them into is that of linguistic determination and linguistic relativity. So what's linguistic determination? Well, it's the idea that language determines how somebody thinks. Now, there's a strong and weak aspect to this. The strong aspect is that language is the only thing that determines how somebody thinks, whereas the weak aspect is that language just affects how we think. So a good example of this is the idea that math is easy to understand for Koreans rather than Americans. Now, one of the reasons this is my parents told me because they know Korean, is that in English, it goes 9, 10, 11. So the concept of double digits is sometimes hard to grasp because we don't have that idea that it's 10 with a 1. Whereas in Hangul, Korean language, it goes Hana, which is 1, Yol, which is 10, and then Yol Hana, which is 11, or 10, 1. And so for Koreans, because of their language, they can grasp that concept easier because it's built into their language. Now, one of the detractors against strong determinists is the fact that language is not the only thing that affects how we think, because obviously Americans can't understand what 11 is. It's 10 with a 1 in it. It's just harder for them to grasp. And so largely a lot of the study will go into the weak linguistic determination, which often falls under linguistic relativity, which is the second category. So what is linguistic relativity? Well, it's also called a weak form of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it's really the idea that languages are distinct, and those distinctions affect somebody's worldview. Now, a quote from Sapir about it basically talked about how humans don't live isolated, they don't live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity, but they live in a way that the particular language becomes a medium for their expression. Now, he also talks about how the fact of the matter is that the real world is affected largely by the language that it's been built upon. And so basically, just in this, breaking down this quote, Sapir is basically talking about that language affects the worldview, that certain words somebody has, the way they communicate, influence how they act and behave, and that's what creates the reality. Kind of an example of what he's talking about is the idea of the word potluck, for usually in vocabulary of Baptists and other Christians a lot in Southern America. And so when I hear the word potluck, I automatically think of ideas of an after-church meal, whether a lunch or a dinner, and it means bringing a dish, whether it means like a roast or something like that. And I have ideas of community, a sense of belonging, kids running around, just food, and a general sense of community and belonging through food. However, one of the things that Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and linguistic relativity in general attempts to explain is why there's a barrier in trying to translate this to other language. You can't just literally translate it potluck, because people think, why is the pot lucky? And then also if you're trying to do it, say, Arabic culture, they don't have a concept of this. They don't have the idea of potluck. They don't have an after religious ceremony meal with the same things going on. They can't fundamentally grasp that. They can experience later on through English, but that language itself creates that culture, that basis in it. Because we have that word, it influences how we think and act. And so understanding that, we can see that linguistic relativity can help us understand why there are barriers that exist. So now we understand that linguistic determination talks about how language kind of influences our thought, and linguistic relativity talks about how languages are distinct and there's barriers because of that distinction, how people think and act in their worldview, can go down to the strengths and weaknesses. Now the main weakness is it's a descriptive and not prescriptive theory, that it's not going to be a lot of practical application, which is a weakness to some. You're not going to be able to know this theory and now go off and automatically think differently, act differently, have a different worldview, because the theory itself says that the way you act and the way you behave is caused by the language you primarily think in. And so there's not a lot of practicality to it. You can't go off and just like use it. Another weakness of it is it's kind of vague. Now, there is a lot of research now, but what Sapir and Whorf were saying back in the 1940s and 50s was really vague, and there's a lot of debate over what were they saying, were they true, do we need empirics, do we not? And so there's still a lot of argument over it, but now a lot of the research focuses mainly on not debating is it true or not, but what are the relationships between language and what are the empirics backing these relationships. So what she's in the strength is that it's a huge field now, because understanding how language works helps translators, helps a lot of making artificial languages for a lot of times for fantasy writers and genres, and then even programming languages, because they could use that to their benefit. And so for them it may be practical, for us it might not be. But it's also a good strength of it is the fact that it tells us something that we know to be true. Now back in the 1940s and 50s, when the language and the theory were being postulated, there wasn't a lot of linguistic study of non-European languages. So then understand that there was diversity. And so it was kind of a radical idea when it was first postulated. However, now we understand languages are distinct. So it kind of proves something we now know to be true. So now that you understand the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, maybe now you can understand why language barriers exist, why you think and act the way you do, how it sometimes confuses friends who don't speak the same language of you. And you can understand and not get as frustrated when language barriers exist, and try to understand that you'll have a harder time telling people what a potluck